This is Rodrigo Arancibia from the High Tech High Graduate School of Education, and I'm here to talk to you about EdSpace, a social learning network. Well, what is EdSpace? EdSpace is a place for you to connect and get curious with the people that you want to connect with. But what EdSpace isn't is a popularity contest like Twitter. It's not a place for you to sit and listen and sit and get like YouTube. EdSpace TV is a personal channel for you to do your own vlogging to tell your story about your experiences. Not comfortable with video yet? It's all good. Every single channel is going to have post-it boards. Write your question down on the post-it board and someone will respond to you with a video post. Social media networks are noisy. That's why we created EdSpace filters. On every single channel, you'll be able to drill down on which educators you want to learn from and which educators you want to get curious with. Whether you're a second grade teacher in Arkansas or a project-based learning teacher in San Diego, use the EdSpace filters to find your people and get curious with them. EdSpace has two types of channels. Public channels that everybody can view and everybody can access, and private channels that only teachers from your school can see. Cool thing is, you can also see which teachers from your school site are signed up for EdSpace. So what's next? Introduce yourself. Pin a video to your personal channel and tell us what you're curious about. Tell us what you're working on. Tell us what you're passionate about. The most important thing is that you get started. Show up and share more.
Welcome everybody to Inspired Conference, Day 1, Future of Schools with Nadeem Nathoo. Session title, Education 3.0, What Everyone is Missing. For this exciting session, we have Nadeem talking to us about what reframing the economy around education means and breaking down what disruptive and transformative innovations in education means. Nadeem is the co-founder of the Knowledge Society, a human accelerator that focuses on exponential technologies like artificial intelligence, virtual augmented reality, nanotechnology, and the Internet of Things. His mission at TKS is to develop young people to pioneer new industries using emerging technologies and sciences. Not only will Nadeem be sharing, but you will also have the opportunity to listen to one of his 16-year-old students, Michael Lee, who will share his view on TKS and the future of schools. Join us for this information-packed session coming up. Hello, Nadeem, welcome.
Hey, great to be here.
Thank you, Nadeem. So Nadeem is the co-founder of the Knowledge Society, TKS, a human accelerator that focuses on exponential technologies like artificial intelligence, virtual augmented reality, nanotechnology, and the Internet of Things. His mission at TKS is to develop young people aged 13 to 17, pioneer new industries, emerging technologies, and sciences. Nadeem, you have said we wanted to build what we wished we had growing up. Can you tell us a little bit more about the TKS mission?
Yeah, well, there's two things that fall into that. The first and the overarching mission of TKS is how can we train people specifically to solve really important problems in the world, right? And what's interesting, I actually can't think of any organization in the world with that specific mission. It's not the universities, it's not the startup accelerators, right? If you think about like MIT or Stanford, a large chunk of those people who are engineers work at like Facebook, Snapchat, TikTok, whatever. Startup accelerators typically historically in the last 5-10 years have made majority of their money on enterprise sales and software as a service solutions. And so I think XPRIZE is really interesting to be able to do that, but I would say it's providing a monetary incentive for really smart people to tackle problems who otherwise wouldn't have, but how can we specifically train people to do that? And what's interesting is if you had, say, a king or queen of the world, right? And their main objective was to optimize quality of life of all their royal subjects. And every week they got a list of all the things that were adversely affecting quality of life, right? So you had like mental health, climate change, poverty, things like that. Imagine them looking at this list and being like, actually, I'm gonna let my royal subjects figure out all these problems without any help and without even being able to see this list. That would sound crazy, right? But that's what the world is today. And so how can we do a better job at being amazing allocators of human capital, because we already have really great allocators of capital, financial capital, right? These are the Warren Buffetts and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, but I actually don't think that there's a really good allocator of human capital. So that's one. The second is when I reflect about, and we talk about specifically, we built what we wish we had growing up. It was about building an organization that actually led us to optimize success versus mitigate risk. And I think, and we can get into this later, I think education, the way it's set up right now, formal education is built to mitigate risk and not really accelerate people's potential. And so, and we've been talking about personalized learning for a long time. That's nothing new. And so it's not to say that that model of, maximizing potential and versus mitigating risk is the right thing for everybody. But I think there is a way where you can do it for anybody. And so that was the idea and the impetus behind starting TKS. And 4.5 years later, we're seeing some pretty interesting outcomes, right? Our students are speaking at conferences in front of tens of thousands of people. They're getting jobs and internships at places like Microsoft, IBM, leading startups in the region. One of our students built a ring that can non-invasively measure blood glucose and cholesterol levels without penetrating the skin. So it's like real-time monitoring of heart disease, diabetes, raised just $8 million recently. 3 years ago, he didn't know anything about really anything. He was a regular 16-year-old kid, right? Didn't really know much about artificial intelligence or medical devices, students curing diseases. So there's a lot of really interesting things happening. And that's really the thing that I'm excited about is it's in a short period of time, the training and the efforts that we are putting into this. It's very clear that people are on that track of using their talents to solve really important problems in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's so many people talking about progression in education. But Nadeem, what are people missing about education?
I think when people talk about education, they use it synonymously with learning. And I think they're different things, education and learning, for a couple of different reasons. The first is when you think about education, to me, the way that I define it is it's institutionalized education. Right? It is people going through a process. And for me, when we think about the purpose of education, going back to this example of if there was a king or queen of the world, I really think if we were being intentional about it, it would be to train people to eventually add value to society. Right now, it seems like we're putting people through a system where they're exposed to content and community without a lot of intention. It's just like, learn the stuff and let's figure out where to go. So that's one piece. The second piece is education is often most associated with content. What? So the what versus the why versus the how. And I think people are talking about that, but evidence that I think not as many people are talking about it is the majority of innovation in ed tech companies in the last 5 to 10 years have been mostly focused around content. And don't get me wrong, I think that's a really important thing, right? You have organizations like Udacity and Udemy and Coursera that are offering the best, content in the world at your fingertips for a fraction of the price. You can do a self-driving car nano degree on Udacity for, $9,000, but get in 8 months and almost get guaranteed a job for $60,000 to $70,000. So the ROI compared to university is a lot greater. The challenge is Udacity only has a 4% completion rate. Right. And so the content is there, but there is a lot more, right? When you think about discipline, community, ambition, mindsets in general, insecurities, courage, I think there's all these things that go hand in hand with the content piece and with the learning piece to actually build a formalized institution of education that, again, will map towards people actually adding value and not coming out of high school or university being like, I have no idea what I want to do and how I want to spend my time. And you're kind of learning on the fly to figure out how you can contribute to society versus thinking about it from first principles, working backwards and being like, hey, this is what the world needs. Let's actually train to figure out how to get there.
Yeah. And I love the word institutionalizing, education. That's very powerful to really reflect on, how it's become so embedded in systemic structures per se. How do we train people to contribute effectively to communities? How do we train people?
So I think that's along the same lines of what I was talking about, which is, and this is a little bit of a hyperbole, but I feel like the way education is right now, especially since in a North American context for sure, right? It's different sort of everywhere else, but it almost feels like, compared to what it could be, a glorified babysitting service, right? And it's really up to the individual and the students and their life experiences and their parents and their environment to figure out how to be able to do this. It's almost like life is the best human development tool or institution, but it's very serendipitous, very unstructured. And so my belief is, why do we have to rely on luck? Why do we have to cross our fingers, hold our breath, and hope that someone comes along to solve these tough problems or add value to society? How can we structure that serendipity a little bit better, right? And I think the way to be intentional about it and to build communities to solve really tough problems is, again, thinking about it from first principles. What do we need? But we need to be able to think 5 to 10 years out. So not think about what we need today, but what are the problems that will need to be solved? And I think that really does have to come from a lot of these companies who are hiring at the end of the day. So what's interesting is, if you go to any computer science, if you take any computer science course at universities right now, most of the time, 99% of the time, companies are not playing a part in developing the curriculum. I mean, I worked at McKinsey, so forget about tech. Business is a really good example. I went to the best business school, allegedly, in Canada. And when I joined McKinsey, I probably had a 2-week advantage over a history major, right? And so, but that if I specifically studied that thing that McKinsey wants, what was the gap, right? What were we not learning? What did I spend 4 years learning that wasn't actually applicable? And I think if McKinsey did play a role, or Facebook or Apple or Google or even startups, it doesn't really matter. But to have really good insight into what are the challenges that they're going to be facing in the next 5 to 10 years and help develop that curriculum. So now we're talking about the what again, which is the content piece, which I still think is really important. And then working backwards, thinking about it for first principles. What are the skills we need to train? I mean, Elon Musk talks about this. He talks about how the way that the current education system is set up is, you learn about a wrench, you learn about a screwdriver, and then you get to grade 12 and you're like, well, what do I do with this? And they're like, we'll figure it out. Whereas what we should be doing is, here's an engine. Here's why an engine's important. Let's take apart this engine. To do, you need a screwdriver to do this. You need a wrench to do this. And all of a sudden you can imagine what are some analogous instances where you might be able to do that too. So in my opinion, that's probably the best way to train people to contribute to communities.
Yeah, great. Experiential learning, I think, comes to mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
And we have Michael coming in now.
Yeah. So, I thought one of the best ways to showcase this is bring in a student who's gone through TKS for a year. He can talk about, and I don't know exactly what he's going to talk about, so he'll surprise us, but this isn't his first rodeo. Some of the projects that he's working on, again, in a short period of time, using these emerging technologies, but also his perspective and opinion, because Michael has been thinking a lot about education and learning in today's day and age as a young person. So I think he can also provide some interesting color. Michael, you want to kick it off?
Yeah. All right, let's get started. Since we're talking about learning, right? I thought of an idea. One of the best hacks to learn more effectively is to actually, especially on a Zoom call like this, is actually be more active. So I was thinking, for the audience, why not we just all get up, just do a few stretches and just get active for a bit. Yeah, just go like this, make some weird faces. Yeah. All right, how are you guys feeling now? Yeah. So today what I want to talk about is give you a framework to think about how we can improve education and what are the questions that we should be asking but aren't. And just to restate, the reason why I'm so passionate about this and why this is so important, like Nadeem said, education is how we unlock human potential, right? And especially nowadays with 1.5 students like me who are now out of our regular school system, it's now more important than ever to focus on this and have a bigger conversation. Now, before I get started, let me first tell you a bit about myself and my story. So my name is Michael. I'm a 16-year-old innovator at the Knowledge Society. And on my free time, I also run a YouTube channel where I try to teach people the mindsets and productivity tools they need to unlock their full potential. Now, my background is I started my first software business at the age of 14. And there's one interesting thing I did when I tried starting this business. Instead of taking the regular route, like taking a course or going to a coding bootcamp, I took a backward approach. I just had this product idea and I just relentlessly figured out what are the skills I need to build that idea. And the way I developed those skills was some backward learning philosophy. So I learned how to code just mainly by copying code at first. And then I learned how to do marketing and eventually even hiring people. And and my motivational incentive there was just money, right? I wanted to make money. I was like 14 years old. Now, one day though, and I still remember this day, I was just walking home from, the movies, and I realized that my entire business actually ended up getting hacked, right? And it was that moment where I really had to make a decision. And I was just thinking where I want to go from here, right? And I decided, I always knew what I was really passionate about is making an impact in the world, and especially changing education. And from that point on, I decided to really invest in myself so I can take this hit now and do something 10 times bigger in the future. So that also coincidentally is when I discovered TKS. And once I joined TKS, I really 10x. So I got introduced and learned about artificial intelligence, and I built projects within AI. So one of the projects I built was Deep Dev. And the goal of that project was to ease the process of students getting into AI. So normally when you think about coding AI, you got to know how to code. But what I made, it was a product that allows people to use a drag and drop editor to build AI models and click one button, and it generates all the code you need to run your model. Now, luckily, I also got the chance to present some of my projects at companies like IBM, Uber, and P&G, all thanks to the Knowledge Society. And nowadays, I'm working on a few different projects, but the project I'm most excited by is actually an online learning platform where I hope to solve some of the problems that I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so now let's get back to the main topic. So when I think about how we can improve education, there's really three big sub-questions I want to ask. It's the what, the how, and the why, right? The what is essentially the direction, and Nadeem talked about that already, so I won't really go into that. The second part is the how. How can we make people learn more efficiently? And the third part is about the why, which is how can we motivate people to learn? So first about the what, I think one key thing that is so obvious is, we got to pick a clear metric and then set up systems to best optimize for those metrics, right? And I think a pretty good metric to use is like technological innovation. It just makes sense, right? The more innovation there is, often the less suffering we have as humanity. And I think the current school system is really failing at that, right? We learn all these mathematics, but where do we learn about, potentially like the tools that have the chance to become like the future internet? Like imagine if you're someone who knew about the internet before it became popular. You have a million times more potential to make a significant impact and build the next Google. And I think the best institution there is right now is TKS, right? They expose you to all these exponential technologies like brain-computer interfaces, AI that have the potential to become the future internet. And with that, it completely increases your potential of building a solution that have the potential to impact billions. And it's just crazy to me that right now our current school system isn't teaching that. But the second thing I want to talk about is efficiency. I have had a lot of thoughts about this, but since we don't have much time today, I'll just talk about really the two most important things in my opinion. So the first thing is a focus on intuition rather than memorization, right? What's funny is the other day I was in physics class, and how the teacher literally taught us was like this. She was like, here are a bunch of worksheets, and here's a physics formula. Do the worksheet 1,000 times or something until you memorize it, and you'll score good on tests. Like that is a default of our current school system. They're not teaching you to actually, understand the information so that you can apply it. It's just about all memorization. And that's just crazy to me. And I think perhaps it might be obvious for people who are watching this conference today, but surprisingly, most students actually don't know about this. Most students don't even know what the idea of building intuition is or building understanding, surprisingly. So I think the key to counteract that, there's really two things. One, to have a larger conversation about building intuition over memorization. The second part is, why not we just teach students how to learn? That's something that still surprises me. Like, it makes sense to teach people how to learn before they learn something, right? And there's not really that in our current education system. And even through online courses like Udemy, etc., there's nowhere where you hear about that. When really, I think the skill of learning is the most important thing, right? And that's something in TKS that they also teach you about, right? How can you just figure things out by yourself? How can you learn, independently of like a school system, like just spoon feeding you information? Now, another thing regarding efficiency, I think is there are a lot of alternate models to learning, right? Right now, our approach has been just spoon feeding people information, right? But there's so many different ways to learn. You can learn from failure, right? You can learn by actually building things. And that was the one that resonated with me the most. I really took a backward approach, like I talked about earlier. And in my opinion, that is much more effective than just spoon feeding people information, right? Because when you take a backward approach and when you force a student to figure things out by themselves, they think like an inventor. Or if it's about mathematics, they think like a mathematician. And that's really what we're aiming for here, right? Because if you have someone who can just, spew out like math equations, that's not gonna equate to any sort of like innovation. Innovation comes when we can think like an inventor, when we can think like a mathematician. So why not build that into our education process? Why not train people by having them actually doing things? The last part, which is the part where I think that's least talked about, is motivation. We now have a lot of these platforms like Udemy or edX that solved a lot about the what problem, right? About content. We also have people like coding boot camps talking about how we can learn more efficiently. There is a lot of good content already online about how, about self-improvement or like mental models to be able to learn faster. But what's least talked about, in my opinion, is motivation. Have you seen any like bootcamp that advertises themselves as, we will unlock the interest of your kid, or like, we will unlock the curiosity of someone? Nowhere, right? It's all about, okay, you learn this, like we just spoon feed you this and you get these skills. But why are we learning this, right? And this is so clear, especially nowadays with where everyone's moving online. How our current school system works in terms of our motivational structure is largely extrinsic motivation. So, for example, the social pressure of getting a bad mark, right, or getting ridiculed by your teacher if you can't answer a question in class. And especially now, when everyone's now doing online school and there's not much of that social pressure around, literally there's two scenarios. One, 90% of kids are literally not doing their homework nowadays. And this is like the majority, even for students that seem to be, like getting good grades, or they just cheat, which makes sense. When everything's relied on extrinsic motivation, they don't actually like want to learn by themselves, right? So they're gonna take the easiest route, which is to just cheat. And no one's gonna find out with like online school. So I think we need to have a conversation about how we can shift that from extrinsic motivation to unlocking someone's intrinsic motivation, right? Because not only one is, the common sense thing is like, if people are not motivated, they're not going to learn, but also it's a multiplier to everything else. If you can unlock someone's motivation, they will just want to learn by themselves, and they're going to learn 100 times more efficiently than someone who's not, right? And if we can have a school system that optimizes, or at least figures out a way to just keep people motivated, and there's so much research on that, for example, within like social media, right? There are like reward circuits, right? There's like gamification. Why aren't we applying that to school, right? And yeah, really, to quickly recap, there's really three big questions that we got to ask, right? One is, what should we learn? And then what are the systems that we should set up to optimize for that? The second part is how we can learn more effectively, which one of the most obvious things is to teach people intuition rather than memorization, or teach people essentially how to learn before they actually learn things. And the third most less talked about thing is motivation. Right? How can we actually keep people motivated to learn, and what are ways that we can leverage the current research and psychology for that? Now, once again, I want to end it off with this. In the beginning, I talked about the stat of 1.5 billion students being out of school. And again, this is how we unlock human potential. And if we don't get this right, if we can't keep our education system up to date, that's how much human potential we're losing out, right? And if we can fix this, then we're going to be facing a future of prosperity. And I think TKS is one of the best institutions that's doing that right now. But I hope there are more people thinking about this, and we can actually make some sort of systemic change eventually into the current education system. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael Yee. Thank you so much. The impact of TKS on full display there. Thank you so much. Such a powerful voice for our peer listeners today. And this is really going to, I think, benefit, what they're also trying to decide to do in the future. So thank you so much, Michael. Nadeem?
Yep. And what I think was really important there is reading in between the lines as well, right? So there are things that Michael chose to say, and then there are things that he chose not to say, and what he chose to focus on. And keep in mind, this is someone who's been thinking about this for a while, someone who is ambitious, someone who is intrinsically motivated, and yet finding that these are the problems that exist. And I think the next step is, how specifically do we address these things, right? Because I think a lot of people know, I would argue most people over the age of 25 know that there are a lot of opportunities for improvement when it comes to education, which is why we're having these conversations. But I think what most people lack is the how. Like, okay, so what do I do next, right? It's almost like this Greta Thunberg thing, which is like, climate change is a problem. We need to do something now. And everyone's like, yeah.
Yes.
But where do I start, right? What do I do? And I think that is something that, I've been thinking about that a lot. And so we can go into some of these specific things like Michael talked about, direction, efficiency, and motivation. This is what we built at TKS through First Principles, and I think we have some tangible steps that we can take, which hopefully will be relevant to these listeners. But I think that'll come out through some of through the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, and Nadeem, I almost heard your voice come through, Michael, there. It could have just been, you speaking. So I see the impact of what is happening in TKS, and this is just one person, Michael. I can imagine, your peer group and your citizens within TKS. It's really, truly amazing, and I hope people pick this up, especially, the generation that you're targeting. Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. Thank you. Nadeem, back to you. What are the three major innovations in education, and how do you define them?
Well, I would say there are three types of innovation whenever we use that word, right? So I think this word has been watered down. And I think we need to raise our standards for what it means when we talk about innovation. So for example, I think if we broke down the word innovation, I think we use it in three ways. There's incremental innovation. So like little improvements that we make. So for example, I have protein powder at home that says, innovative new protein. And it's like, how much more innovative can protein get, right? It's like 2% better, 5% better, whatever. Then there's disruptive innovation. So this is like Netflix to Blockbuster as an example. So you're still delivering kind of a similar service, but you're doing it in a completely new way, allows it to scale, take advantage of economies of scale, things like that. And then the last level of innovation, I think, is transformative innovation, right? What completely changes the game in terms of how we behave. So the internet is one of those things. Planes are another one. Like without planes, we wouldn't be able to have international business, experience different cultures to the extent that we can, all of that stuff, right? Internet, unprecedented interconnection between people. I think our biology was just at such a shock because at any given time we've been in small communities, and now we have access to tens and thousands and millions of people at our fingertips, again, which really had to change the way in which we live. But I think for the most part, when we've been talking about innovation in education, it's been mainly around incremental innovation. I think there are some institutions that are focusing on disruptive innovation. I think very few are completely trying to think about it from first principles and just, think about it from, say, aliens came down today, they understood the needs of the world. How would they build what education looks like from the ground up? And using the tools that we have today. So that's the difference, right? Between what we couldn't do 20, 30 years ago.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's the way that I would like to think about innovation. I mean, I'll give you an example, and this is something, so if we think about the last biggest innovation that has happened in education, in my opinion, right, that people have been talking about for a really long time, not social emotional learning or all that stuff, is probably the teacher to student ratio. You have a higher teacher to student ratio, you'll get better outcomes. I call BS on that. And you can just do a simple thought experiment, right? Say you have the best ratio in the world. You have 1-to-1 or 1-to-2, but the teacher is not a good teacher. You're not going to have better outcomes by virtue of the ratio. And if you think about it, this is what we've been talking about for a really long time. I actually think now, especially since we have a lot of these tools and content, like if you wanted to learn computer science, Stanford puts all of their first year computer science lectures online. There should be no reason to have a substandard CS education, or calculus, or even if we're thinking about secondary school, right? Calculus, science, biology, whatever. So all that content is there. So now it is now possible to learn through community versus a one-to-one interaction. You don't need to go to a library or need to go to an institution that has the best resources, and that's where you get an edge. Most people have access to a lot of the stuff at their fingertips. So as like right now at TKS, we have 2 directors who are not teachers. They're former founders. They've worked at top tech companies, influential roles in startups, VC consulting, whatever. They have a lot of real world experience and solved real problems. But the ratio is probably 1-to-80 at its max, at its peak. But it works really well because you have this person who provides the direction, who again teaches you to learn how to learn, but the what itself is very much autodidactic, right? It's set goals for yourself. And I think the interesting thing here is, and this is another quote unquote innovation to me, it's just the way that makes sense of doing things. Instead of measuring someone against an objective bar, right? So, 98% of math, we should be measuring people in terms of how much they're growing against themselves week after week, because people come in with different experiences at different levels, different biology, everything, right? And I really think if you use this model, learning can be, and education can be benchmarked against yourself versus everybody else. And I'm happy to go deeper into that if people are interested, but that is a way where it's then possible to learn through community versus learn through someone and give a lot of attention in terms of guidance and things like that. Yeah. So there's a lot more I could say to that, but I'm happy to pause here.
Absolutely, yeah, and as opposed to conformity, how do you become completely disruptive and innovative? If you could speak a little bit about that, Nadeem.
So how we can be disruptive? Yes. So I think we need to think about more than just, again, the content and the confines of what we think education can be. So we're still thinking about in-person facilities. We're still thinking about the types of people delivering delivering the content, the what, but I think there's a lot more than that. There's the infrastructure that surrounds education, right? There's not physical infrastructure. I just mean like all of the tools and everything that we use at our disposal. Right now, we're thinking about incremental innovation because we're thinking about what we have in the classrooms today, what tools are available today. But let's think about best case scenario based on what exists in the world. How might it look like? I think people who are in this space need to have a heightened level of ambition, because if you're not ambitious to figure out how you can do this in a meaningful way, again, I think we're going to be stuck at incremental and disruptive innovation. You need someone who's thinking really, really big, and you see this in virtually every other industry, especially industries that have completely 10x, 20x, 100x in the last couple of years. And one of my favorite quotes is, the limit of global ambition is the limit of global progress is the ambition of the most ambitious. Wow. Right? The limit of global progress is the ambition of the most ambitious. And I think this applies to even an industry like education. Who is the person in this space right now who is like, I'm going to completely change the game? And there are a couple of organizations that did it, and I think we could talk about that a little bit later. I think economic models is a huge one. what's interesting for me, and this is a little bit of a qualm of mine, is that, and by the way, I agree. So a lot of people say education should be free, right? It should be a public good. It should be like water. Fine. I like that. I like the idea behind that. But if someone comes up with a way to create a lot of value, and in order to grow, they need to capture that value to reinvest, it almost feels like they're evil for doing that, for capturing value in education. Whereas someone can sell, you know, high-end bags, you can sell tobacco, you can go to nightclubs, where it's okay to make money off all those things that aren't really adding to value to society. But if you come up with a truly disruptive way or transformative way to create a ton of value in education, it's almost like, no, you can't capture that. So now you have a lot of these people who are like, you know, I really do want to disrupt education, but let me start this AI company first, make $100 million, and then eventually I'm gonna do this, right? Funding behind it is also completely broken, which I think leads back to the economic models. Is if you were someone who wanted to raise VC funding, private equity funding, raise money from banks, you got to show that there's some sort of economic incentive there. And so I really think that, you know, if we think about all of this infrastructure that surrounds education, we just need to think about that completely different. And once we do that, and I think if we become a little bit more accepting around that, I think you could start to see a lot more models being tested versus kind of being stuck in the box that we're in. And I really think that it's a self-induced box that we're in.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nadeem. And I know that can go on in you know, explanation. And yeah, we invite, you know, viewers to send in questions later on for Nadeem if you want to know further on this matter. Measuring one's ability through what brings them to mastery. That's a big statement. Can you elaborate on that, Nadeem?
Yeah, so when you and I were chatting about this, and again, I think that we're uniquely able to do this now because of the internet and technological innovation and things like that. But the way historically school has been set up today in terms of its evaluation is, say you're learning fractions and you get a 60% on your final fractions exam. What happens? Well, you go to the next grade, you passed, right? And you learn algebra, and algebra involves fractions. And if you have a 60% understanding of fractions, there's no way you're going to be able to fully comprehend or do well in algebra. And so what happens is you take this exam, that's the grade you get, and we go on to the next one. Whereas I firmly believe, again, if we are just thinking about what makes sense, and the way that my mind works is like, okay, forget about what's practical for a second. I know it's really hard, but what is the best case scenario? Is it not the best case scenario for everyone to have a good understanding of all the content that we think is important? If that's the case, let's figure out how to get people to a level of mastery before they move on to the next step. And this is what Sal Khan also talks about, which is, you know, how can you get a 90, 95, 100% in fractions and then move on to algebra? Now, the challenge with that in practice is that people develop at different paces, and you need to have some sort of standard and structure. So people think, you know, we have provincial level exams and SATs and things like that. So it makes it very, very difficult for us to be able to do that, which is why I'm talking about how we need a fundamental shift in our infrastructure. Because if we're even allowed to think differently, if we have the permission to question some of these assumptions and figure out what new models look like, which is why I think we're seeing a lot of innovation in places like Southeast Africa, places like Finland and in Europe, Bali, with the Green School, because they don't have a lot of these constraints around curriculum of what you need, what you legally need to operate as a school. And so I'm excited to actually see that happen in the next 10 to 15 years, to be used as use cases, so that hopefully we're able to make, or making infrastructure changes is a lot easier.
Yeah. And a model that also feeds back into being disruptive, you know, as we were discussing in our previous question.
Yeah.
What are the 3 areas, Nadeem, our listeners today can focus on? If you could bring it down to 3 areas.
Yeah. What 3 areas should really smart people in the world be focusing on? So in my opinion, I actually think if you are a capable individual, again, in my opinion, you should be focusing on one of 3 areas: health, energy, and education. Okay. I think these are the things that are going to completely and dramatically improve quality of life of everyone everywhere. Energy is directly tied. It's the #1 contributing factor to standard of life. Health is the #1 contributing factor to quality of life. And I think education, again, is an infrastructural thing that allows people to be self-agent and have a level of self-awareness and feel capable enough to even live a meaningful life and contribute back to society and all those things. Now, unfortunately, when we think about the current landscape of where really smart people are spending their time, I would say it's in places like finance, advertising, manufacturing, retail, all those things, again, which some of those are valuable. But if you think about what are the top contributing factors to quality of life, standard of life, and all that stuff, it really is these 3 areas, and it's completely disproportionate. I would say probably 10, 20% of really smart people are working in these areas. And then if you double click and you go into these 3, I would argue, and this isn't based on a study, this is very anecdotal based on my opinion, I would say probably 75% of these really smart people are working on health, 20% are working on energy, and maybe 5% working on education. Now, I would actually argue, and this is I'm in this space, there's no disrespect to anyone, it's probably the least smartest people in that whole list working on that, right?
Yeah.
And so to me, if you're listening to this and you're thinking about where should I dedicate my time, and it really depends on what your mental model is. And I think this goes back to the whole infrastructure piece. I think the reason why people focus on advertising and finance is because that's where you can make the most money. But again, we know, and most of us who have experienced life enough know that after a certain point, money doesn't matter as much to someone's happiness. And so, but it certainly helps. Like, if we can't change that piece, it certainly helps to create some sort of economic incentive for people to work in these areas. So I think I would argue those are the 3 areas where really smart, capable people should spend time and energy focusing on more.
Yeah, health, education, and energy. Interestingly, Nadeem, these are the, I think, three core pillars as well in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's such a push, to get people focused, get funding focused, so that there's, sustainability in the future coming through. What are some steps, Nadeem, that we can initiate to optimize and maximize human potential?
So this is a big question, right? I think one of the things that we really need to do is remove this notion that failure exists. And failure is so taboo. So I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley before I came back to Canada. If you fail in Silicon Valley, or if you fail in Canada, people are a little bit like, I don't know, should I give you my money? I'm a little bit more like, will you do it better this time? Whatever. In San Francisco, it's just learning, right? It's a stripe on your belt. It's like, oh yeah, you failed. Well, you're definitely not going to make the same mistakes next time. The attitude is completely changed. If you think about life outside of the Silicon Valley bubble, failure is avoided and it's heavily frowned upon, right? You get a bad mark, it's frowned upon, right? You lose a game, it's frowned upon. Like, everything is just frowned upon. Whereas to me, and actually there's a basketball player, late Kobe Bryant, said this. He actually said there's no such thing as failure to him. And the example that he uses is like, say I want to compete for an NBA championship and I do everything right, but I get traded to the worst team randomly. It's out of my control. Did I fail? It was, right? Something happened to me. Okay, now say I was on the best team and I just wasn't putting in the work and I was being a little lazy, whatever, and I wasn't doing the best that I could, and say we don't win. Did I fail? It's like, no, I just didn't put in more effort to be able to do it. And so in my opinion, when you think about failure, I agree with him. It doesn't exist. It's either you're right or you learn. You get the result or you improve, right? And what I think we need to do is create a lot more systemic opportunities for failure. I mean, you can ask Michael, I don't know if you saw on the call right now, but at TKS, the first couple months is like, we just set you up for a ton of failure, but then also make it clear that that's okay. Like, let's put you in positions where you're working on tough things and raising your bar for difficulty. And I think that's how in a short period of time, our students are doing things like curing disease or working on quantum machine learning or, working in labs to figure out, I mean, we have a couple students right now working with some of the leading research in the world on COVID vaccines and therapies, but that's because we're raising their bar for difficulty. And you had to fail enough and you had to struggle enough to be able to even get to that point, right, where you're able to add that value.
And also, just to jump in, one example I think that could illustrate this is one of the first things we did was they had us make a presentation without telling us like how to do it properly, right? So we just did like what we learned in school, and they turned out to be complete crap, right? And they just roasted us, and we learned from that so much, right? And I think one other thing is the reason why failure is so good at teaching is there's this like emotional connection, right? I'm definitely not going to make a crappy presentation again after that first session. But that's one example of learning through failure at TKS.
And I would say there's two other things that are really important. The first is identifying what high standards look like. So oftentimes, and I'm not saying this is true across the board, but say, for example, we think being a great presenter is important. If you ask a teacher, what does a 10 out of 10 presentation look like? If they gave you something that was actually a 7 out of 10, but they thought it was a 10 out of 10, that means curious and driven and ambitious young people are just spending a lot of time being a little bit better than average. And so what you need to do is actually show what is a 10 out of 10, and then give them really good feedback on how to get there.
Yeah.
And if you do those things really well, then I think you will play in a lot shorter period of time, you'll be able to effectively maximize the development of a young person.
Yeah. Creating systemic opportunities for failures. I think that should be our next inspired theme.
Right?
Absolutely. How often do people hear that? They talk about successes, but they don't talk about safety nets for failures and how that's set up to, bring you up to the next level. So absolutely, it's just so important that, that message, that narrative goes out for those who are listening. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Michael Yee, for that bit as well. And, post-pandemic, COVID-19 and all the discussion on reimagining and reinventing and resetting. What does reimagining the economy around education, Nadeem, mean?
So I've talked about this a little bit, but I want to give you a specific example. There was a company called AltSchool that I believe started 7-8 years ago, and they raised $100 million in Silicon Valley. And the goal there was to completely rethink what education looks like. Again, tons of money. They had the war chest to be able to do it. Around 2 years ago, they recently folded because they ran out of money. What happened was when they were building out these schools, they ended up being cost centers. The economics just wasn't there. And that's partly, I think, a little bit more thinking around that could have avoided that. But again, there's a lot of unforeseen circumstances. But the second thing is when investors give you money, they expect, hopefully a 10x return on that money, given the risk profile that they're taking. And so what happened is a lot of investors were like, hey, you should transition to a software solution that's better able to make money. And so they had a lot of pressure. So the idealistic founders went in wanting to do this thing, but the people who gave them the money was like, hey, here's what you need to do instead. And that was not their expertise, and that was not their vision, kind of forced them to go through this path, and it ended up folding. And now I think very few investors are willing to touch education with a 10-foot pole, right? Unless it is very much focused on software and content and scalability. Whereas if you think about other industries like energy, for example, if you're building a nuclear fusion reactor like ITER in Europe, ITER, which is a consortium of a bunch of companies and scientists coming together to figure out how to crack this, that's a 20-year plus vision, and that they've been already working on for years. But we've got to the point where it's acceptable. Even pharma is another good example, right? It's acceptable to have 10, 15-year life cycles because that's historically what the industry has been. But because education has been so fragmented, we're not thinking about this as economic opportunity or a business area, which is why it's hard to figure out and be acceptable why longer term time horizons or returns, again, are acceptable. Another model that's been popping up recently is income sharing agreements. And I think this is very, very fascinating. So there's a company called Lambda School that's come out and says, you know, in 8 to 9 months, you can get a full computer science education for free, right? So you can just come in for free. And if you get a job, only if you get a job, we'll take a % of your salary. Here's why it's good. One, it removes the barriers for anyone to be able to participate in this. Two, the incentives are directly aligned with performance. So now this company doesn't make money until you get a job, which is what I think it should be. Whereas if you think about a university right now, if you pay and you get some sort of history major and you don't get a job after that, they're like, we don't care. And when they succeed, it's okay, well, we can just use that as a brand of our school, right? And it's, we kind of help build this. But so those are two reasons why I really like the ISAs. But even despite that, ISAs are not an innovation in education. ISAs are an innovation in finance. It's a financial instrument, right? It is a new way to package human potential. It's a security, right? And now you can repackage these ISAs, sell them off to some people. And so again, this has been a really big innovation in education, but I would argue that it hasn't, because anything that comes down to money can be repackaged in certain ways. And we've been doing that for a long period of time. Those are like credit swaps or, you know, collateralized debt as an example. And I would say the last thing is the World Economic Forum came out with this report recently that highlighted, it was like the top education models or schools of the future. And it was cool that they named us on that list. But when I was reading through the list, I was thinking that, you know, a lot of these organizations are fine. Like they're interesting, high pitch interesting. Like, yeah, they're interesting, right? But nothing really game changer. And I think there was only one other organization on that list that had global ambitions, but it was a low touch, community-based solution. And I'm like, if this is the extent of the people in the world that are thinking about this in a very ambitious and a big way, again, I think we need more smart people in the world working on this problem, but thinking very ambitiously about it. Bill Gates has talked about how his main focus with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been health and education. Health he's been making a lot of progress on. Education he's almost made negative progress on. He talks about this publicly, right? All the money that he spent on it. And so I think we are living in a world right now where money will start to be there, especially with this COVID situation where a lot of people are thinking about and viewing this as an opportunity. But I really think we just need more smart people in the world working on this. So, you know, if you are listening to this and a lot of these ideas resonate, or even if you disagree, it doesn't matter. Well, let the market decide, right? Let's figure out how to get money. Let's test this model. Let's iterate. And even if it fails, that's okay. That's at least one other thing that we tried in the space versus, again, just trying to iterate very incrementally.
Yeah. Thank you, Nadeem. And I think, you know, with what is happening in the world today, people are looking not to go back into, you know, the former, but looking into the new norm, as you know, they call it. In summary, Nadeem, what are some takeaways, in your opinion, for our viewers today?
So I think we need to have the courage to think about what education should look like from the ground up versus taking much more of an iterative approach. I think people should be more willing to think about other sides of education versus just the content or the environment or the person. I mean, we talked about some of these things like economic models and infrastructure and even mindsets and getting other stakeholders involved, like companies. And I would say the last thing is really kind of what Michael was talking about. I think the only way we can get to this future is really leading with the why and starting with the why, because I think intrinsic motivation comes from when people understand why they're actually doing what they're doing. And this isn't a very difficult concept, but I think the implication here is that it probably needs to be incorporated a lot more into teacher training. I think it needs to be a default in terms of how people talk about things in general. And just to kind of go back, if you think about what we value in humans, forget about what we value in employees, right? So what we're training for, but what we just value in humans, I think we value problem solving, communication, collaboration, right? All these things, dealing with ambiguity. I don't think very many people would argue with that. Whereas if you think about what we're doing currently in school, it's like, you know, there's no room for ambiguity. There's always an answer at the end of the textbook. That for problem solving. So there's no room for problem solving. There's always an answer. There's no room for ambiguity because you know exactly what you're learning in grade 7, grade 8, grade 9, grade 10, whatever. It's hyper competitive. It's not collaborative. And we don't really get taught how to communicate very effectively. So we just think about those 4 things, let alone all these others. And none of this really has to do with content as much. It really just has to do with our attitude towards this and our willingness to make change. And so if you're not in a position of power, create yourself to be in one by starting an organization or company, because again, the money is there. And I think we're starting to rethink this stuff. And if you are, have the willingness to take risks and fail, right? But think about this 10x, not 10%. And I think if we do those things, we'll move in the right direction.
Nadeem Nathoo, co-founder of TKS, and Michael Yee, ambassador of TKS. Thank you so much for talking to us about Education 3.0, what people are missing in education today. Thank you so much.
Awesome.